everybody, Shannon and Karen with Wandering Out Yonder. Today we are back again here at the Appalachian Trail Museum in a continuing series of the Appalachian Trail Museum and the community that surrounds it. Today we were invited to participate in the celebration of 75 years of thru hiking. They have some speakers lined up for today. It's going to be an awesome day, and we're going to share with you what we see. Great.
Hi, welcome to beautiful Pine Grove Furnace State Park, hosts for this event. As you know, that the Earl Shaffer Foundation and the Appalachian Trail Museum are coordinating this program together, and we're delighted to see such a big turnout. Thank you all for coming. I want to point out that we do have members of the press, and we have the Appalachian Trail Museum has videographers who are recording the event. So if there's anybody who would prefer not to be on camera, please make sure you're not in view of the camera. We hope, we want to accommodate everybody's wishes. Okay, but this is being recorded. So welcome. My name is Sanne Bagby, and I am the president of the Earl Shaffer Foundation right now. I should point out that many members of our board are here today, and we're delighted. This is the first time in 13 years that our board was able to get together and meet in person. So we're also extremely excited for all kinds of reasons. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Earl Shaffer Foundation very briefly. It was started in the last year of Earl's life. He started along with his brother John, and its primary goal is to publish Earl's many beautiful poetry, pieces of poetry. It's also to preserve his legacy, to educate about hiking, about trails, about nature, and about conservation, and it has a goal of benefiting people and organizations who share those values. Earl was a lot of things, okay? He was a lot of things. He was a prolific and gifted writer of poetry and songs. He was a musician, a photographer. He was a skills craftsman, loved working with his hands. He revered hard work, and he saw frugality as a virtue. He was well read, and after a really excellent high school education, it was actually an equivalent of a college degree, he became self-educated. He knew a lot about a lot of different things. He was an outspoken activist for nature and trails and conservation, and he was a staunch advocate for Native American rights. Many people didn't know that. And this he did long before it became vogue to be supportive of those things. He was a soldier in World War II, stationed in the South Pacific for 4 years, and he grew very tired of the mindless bureaucracy. He had no patience for it. Weary to the bone of all of the senseless killing, the bloodshed, war. And he hiked the trail to walk off the war. I think you've maybe heard that many times. He was also a man who deeply, deeply loved his family and appreciated them. And incidentally, this is also the reunion occasion for the Earl Shaffer Foundation, of which we have many, many members here. I'm looking forward to meeting some of you. So we are here today to celebrate 75 years of thru hiking, which all started with Earl's first thru hike in 1948. And we're also here to dedicate the Darlington Shelter, which Earl helped build in 1956, and that will be later in the program today. Our first speaker today, unfortunately, was unable to attend. This is Brian King from the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. He is also an author, and he just knows so much about the Appalachian Trail. And we have Dan Shafer, nephew to Earl. Come on up, Dan. And Dan will be reading the notes that Brian King had prepared, and I'll let him talk more about that. I also want to say that Dan is our secretary and treasurer for the Earl Shaffer Foundation.
Thank you, Sanne. Yeah. Brian King really would have liked to be here, but he explained to me the mother of his closest friend of 45 years passed away. He really felt that he needed to support his friend at her mother's funeral. So he asked me if I could present his remarks for him, which I'm honored to do. And I have some copies for the press and a few extras of his remarks that I can provide afterwards. Brian was with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for 35 years as an employee, and about 12 years before that as a volunteer with the ATC. And he's an author, a book on the Appalachian Trail, America's Trail. And he was publisher for the ATC. That means he was basically in charge of the books and the magazines that they were publishing. So let me just share his remarks. So this is from Brian King. Thank you, everyone, for coming this morning. And I'm sorry I'm not with you. I was especially looking forward to hearing Silas's perspectives until a personal matter came up at the last minute. You are here today to fittingly talk about and honor Earl's legacy. Personally, I think he had several legacies, not all of which are properly discussed. At ATC in the late 1980s, we knew Earl was watching some regional meetings in the shadows, but it wasn't until I think the early 1990s that I finally met him. The timing was perfect. We had exhausted our usable stock of the first printing we did of Walking with Spring, but I didn't know how to contact him about a second printing. That's when he just showed up one day and quickly agreed. I believe it's been reprinted about 10 times since. That's one well-known legacy. Keep in mind that he assigned all royalties to the ATC, and well more than 25,000 copies had been sold. Also keep in mind that Earl had little in the way of material goods to give and could have used royalties. Everything came from his mind and his heart. The only thing Earl asked of me as his publisher for about a decade before he passed was to restore to the back cover for the third printing the photograph of his boots. He loved that image. Although I read recently that curators at the Smithsonian are not so fond of the books themselves, or the boots themselves, keeping the drawer therein tightly closed. There's 75 years of trail stink. That book, Walking with Springs, is one legacy, or part of one if you consider his story a singular legacy. Many, many people know of his hiking, or at least the first through hike, and maybe the third, thanks to the Today Show, and that inspired thousands. The readers of the book focus on that first hike, naturally and almost entirely on the way the trail helped to walk off the war for Earl. That inspiration as an icon to similarly dispirited modern combat veterans is perhaps the best known part of Earl's legacy, and that is important. But I often wish people would more closely read Walking with Spring and absorb his poet's eye for the natural world and the supernatural around him as he walked along a trail very different from what it is today. The effects of his hike didn't begin with ATC's publication of Walking with Spring in the 1980s, or his own attempts to get it into the marketplace earlier. The news media of the time did write about his unprecedented 1948 accomplishment. And then came National Geographic and other outlets that Myron Avery and Gene Stevenson from the ATC had been prodding unsuccessfully for 15 years to write about the Appalachian Trail. After Earl's hike, interest from the general public soared, even though it would be another 25 years before significant numbers of hikers attempted to follow in his footsteps. That was a legacy in two parts: the sharpened public awareness of the Appalachian Trail, a gift to America, and the flood of mail that came into the ATC offices, staffed by volunteers working in the evenings after their day jobs. That brings me to what I feel is Earl Shaffer's true legacy. He set an example of giving back for the opportunity he had been given, the opportunity to experience this footpath and its surrounding lands and people. Right away, Earl volunteered to help with all that flood of mail that the ATC started to receive. The position on the ATC Board of Corresponding Secretary was created for Earl by the leaders who, 75 years ago this month, were initially more than a little skeptical of his story. Skepticism he accepted with grace and dissolved with his notes, memory, and scores of photographs. He made it past Gene Stevenson, whose ghost I always felt near me for 35 years at ATC. Exactly how he managed to respond to those inquiries from prospective hikers that a pamphlet wouldn't handle is not clear in the records. After all, he was in York, Pennsylvania, and they were in Washington, D.C., and communications mediums were not that agile in those days. Some might say that a part of that legacy also was ATC's similar grilling of other future thru hikers if they wanted to get into the record books, which was actually formalized for quite some time. Not exactly the star chamber of Henry VIII or Charles I, but I'm sure it wasn't pleasant. That part wasn't done away with until the late 1970s, perhaps when there were too many hikers, or perhaps when the officials first encountered Warren Doyle. In any case, Earl gave back. He built shelters, which is the other reason for today's gathering. He scouted better routes. He shared the lessons he learned. He attended meetings. Parenthetically, he told me that he never spoke directly with Myron Avery, but I have photos of him at some Avery-led meetings. Even 40 years or more later, he would still drive down to Harper's Ferry, often to pick up boxes of books he could sell himself. We would sit on the bench on the ATC porch and talk for as long as he wanted, talks I remember fondly. Some of it would be assessing the skills of the better-known hikers of the present. Some of it would be gossip about those long past. Some of it would be about his legitimate hurt feelings about the failure to route the new trail closer to him. Best of all for me, he could tell me more about the Appalachian Trail figures I could only read about on some dry pieces of paper in the archives. He knew them and was one of the very few people still alive in the 1990s who did know them. Earl was a very special human being, with much from his different life to impart to others, quite apart from his hikes and trail work. The motivation behind that trail work, to me, is Earl's greatest legacy. He set an example for other thru hikers and trail users by giving back. Many, but not most in recent years, have followed that example. The trail behind this museum is an example of that giving back. One can only hope that more of today's hikers recognize that example and continue that legacy of Earl V. Shafer. Please enjoy the rest of this celebration of a very special member of the AT community whose legacies have yet to be fully rewarded. So that is Brian's message. Thank you on Brian's behalf. And just want to mention before I hand the microphone back to Sanne. Okay. Yeah. Okay. About a year ago, David Donaldson, who was co-writer of Earl's biography, A Grip on the Mane of Life, discovered among Earl's effects a pile of old posters that Earl had made around 1968 to advertise his slide lecture on his first Appalachian Trail hike. And going through them, David found that there were about 100 of those original posters that were still in fairly decent condition. And so the board of directors of the Earl Shaffer Foundation decided to make these available to people who loved Earl or are interested in his legacy.
And wait, because left the building. I welcome everybody. I have the great pleasure of introducing the next speaker, Silas Chamberlain. He is an independent scholar, an historian, an environmental policy analyst, and the author of the Appalachian Trail, celebrating America's hiking trail. And it is indeed America's hiking trail, the first of those wonderful long trails. Silas, thank you very much.
Well, thanks everybody. It's a real honor to be here with all of you. And I just want to preface this at the beginning by saying I'm a hiking historian. There aren't that many of us out there, and when they give us a mic, we just want to keep talking and talking about trails and hiking. So as I see people nodding off or getting antsy, then I'll skip to the end of my remarks. So, and I also want to say that in some ways I'm an imperfect person to talk about Earl Shafer because I never personally met Earl. I graduated high school the year that Earl passed away, and actually hadn't heard a lot about Earl until about 15 years ago when I started researching the history of Pennsylvania hiking as a graduate student, and then went on to write a national history of hiking in America. And of course, Earl's name came up many times. And when you're a historian writing about hiking, the archives that you rely on are the written records of hiking clubs and hikers. And unlike Civil War collections or famous politicians' papers, these archives are not at a well-established library or a very prominent archive. They're literally in the cardboard boxes and binders in people's basements and attics that they've accumulated over a long period of time, which is one of the reasons the AT Museum is so special, that the AT really does have this singular place. So in the course of my research, I was fortunate to sit at many kitchen tables around Pennsylvania and around the country and review decades-old material with club members. And my very first visit is one that I'll never forget. It was a small town outside of Williamsport. I was there to look at several binders of newsletters, and it was in the home of a man named Maurice Forrester. And some of you know that name. Maurice was a longtime leader in the Keystone Trails Association, wrote a long time, for many years, a column about hiking in Pennsylvania for the KTA, I think was the newsletter editor. And Kate and I went up to Earl's home, and we went out to a local diner and had grilled cheese. And the first name that he mentioned to get me started on my path of 15 years of writing about hiking history was Earl Shaffer. And he remembered the various ways that he had interacted with Earl over the years, from Earl's volunteer roles with the KTA and the Susquehanna Appalachian Trail Club, to spending time hiking along Earl during his third and his final thru hike. But the thing that I really remember most about that conversation 15 years ago was just the awe and the enthusiasm coming from Maurice regarding Earl, almost as if Earl was this mythical feature of the hiking community that I was trying to start writing about. And as I visited dozens and dozens of archives in people's homes over the years, I would find myself in that conversation over and over again. Longtime hiking club members could say with specificity that they had had a conversation with Earl, maybe around a campfire during a KTA gathering, or had heard him play his guitar and sing his poetry, or they had hiked several miles with him during one of his thru hikes. And these brief encounters with Earl had made deep impressions on these folks, even though they themselves were longtime leaders in the hiking movement in America. So even before I started to piece together what would become my book, A National History of Hiking on the Trail, I knew Earl was going to be an important story, important part of my story, both for the history of hiking, but also the culture of hiking and the way that we think about hiking. But it wasn't until I started to really piece together the long history of hiking from the early 19th century up to present that I understood Earl's pivotal role in hiking culture, which began with his 1948 thru hike, but as Brian indicated, went much, much further in terms of legacy. And part of that is because for nearly a century before Earl's hike, hiking had been seen as a group activity. The hiking clubs that formed in the 1830s and 40s and 50s were formed mostly by urban residents in places like Boston and New York City that had been freed by walking every day because of evolutions in transportation technology and networks, the rise of the middle class, so they had leisure time, and a new invention called the weekend. So people actually had a day off of work where they could go out. Usually it was just a Sunday, but they would go out either in lieu of church or after church for a hike. In 1876, the nation's first large, well-organized hiking club was founded, the Appalachian Mountain Club, and they were founded in Boston to organize group outings and publish a journal, conserve the Appalachians, and including the White Mountains. And this AMC model was duplicated over and over again, including in 1892 with the Sierra Club's founding in San Francisco. And these clubs, wherever they were incredibly immersive social experiences. Hikers found club membership at the center of their personal lives, and they spent countless hours forging friendships, sometimes even marriages, between fellow club members. And by the time of the early 20th century, in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, hiking clubs had proliferated throughout major cities on the East Coast and the West Coast, including cities in Pennsylvania like Allentown, Philadelphia, Reading, Williamsport, York. Each had club memberships in the multiple hundreds of thousands of members. And there are many accounts of their hikes, which would be sometimes just in the city on city streets, sometimes would be in the suburbs, and sometimes would be out in rural areas. But the interesting thing about these early groups is that they didn't have a strong preference one way or the other about walking through pristine nature. They were interested in experiencing places. So they would seek out small towns. They would walk along country lanes. They would go to new infrastructure that was being developed, like sewage treatment plants. They would walk up power lines because they knew they could get a good view from the top. They just wanted the experience of being together in a variety of different settings. And in some ways, that's a preview of how Earl would look at the way that the Appalachian Trail could be experienced by going through historic landscapes and through small towns. And of course, one of the most tangible things that these early hiking clubs did was start to build trails. Including some of the earliest long-distance trails, the Long Trail in the Green Mountains, the Horseshoe Trail across southeastern Pennsylvania, the Darlington Trail along the ridges northwest and northeast of Harrisburg, and of course the AT. And the common goal of completing these trails was a way to unite hiking clubs from multiple states and regions, spending long days of shared labor building trails, scouting, clearing, maintaining, and the result was a close-knit community of men and women with a shared culture of hiking and trail building. But while long distance trails could bring all these different groups together and have people work together, they also resulted in a new type of hiker, the thru hiker. And the idea of thru hiking, a long distance trail walking from end to end, had its roots in the 19th century pedestrianism movement, which was where people would literally fill stadiums to watch somebody walk around a track for 24 hours straight and see how far they could go. Or they would start a stopwatch in New York City and somebody would walk to Washington, D.C. And so walking was this big spectacle in the 19th century. But the idea of doing that on a wilderness path really emerged on the Long Trail in Vermont in the 1920s. So bear with me for a second, because I'm going to talk about the Long Trail for a minute, but I promise it's because I want you to understand how people viewed long distance thru hiking prior to Earl's Walk in 1948. So in 1926, 22 years before Earl's Walk, with 278 miles of the Long Trail in place, a milk salesman and member of the Green Mountain Club named Irving Appleby claimed to have walked the entire Long Trail in 12 days and 5 hours. That would have been cool. The news was actually very welcomed by the GMC's founder, Joseph Taylor, who thought that the feat was, quote, a good chance to get something for the Associated Press. And he even envisioned an ongoing competition, quote, where hiker after hiker tries to better the record already made. So the following year, in that spirit, Appleby completed a second hike, this time claiming he had broken his old record. But by then, the GMC had started to fear this sort of spectacle that was being created, and they balked at his claims and asked him to substantiate them. So Appleby once again walked the Long Trail, and this time he took a cameraman with him, and he took photos all along the way. And again, the GMC refused to accept the record, but the public was fascinated. Appleby had already made the Boston papers, and as his fame grew and the public started to pay attention, they would see that store windows in downtown Boston were exhibiting his trail clothes, his sweat-stained shirt, his battered pack, and even his worn boots, which sounds very familiar to how Earl would be remembered. In 1927, on the Long Trail, a group of 3 women, 2 teachers and a college student, walked the Long Trail in 27 days. They were known as the Three Musketeers, and the GMC gave them a warm reception. And Appleby, who had walked it now 3 times and had been turned down twice, was predictably a little bit upset and complained that the club accepted their achievement with no substantiation. The controversy continued in the years to come, with hiker after hiker doing a hike, GMC rejecting them or accepting them with no real standards, and the whole situation devolved. End-to-end hiking, it was not called thru hiking at the time, had quickly turned from a potential boon to the trail in terms of attracting people and raising PR to a divisive spectacle. In April 1928, the GMC passed a resolution saying speeds and speed records and thru hikes undermined the intention of the trail, and although the club would eventually begin issuing certificates again for end-to-end hikes, it wouldn't recognize any other hiking feats. Some of you may be familiar with the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference. They, in 1921, had to deal with 3 hikers who crossed the 24-mile Ramapo-Dunderberg Trail in less than 9 hours, followed by a member of the Fresh Air Club of New York City who completed it in 5.5 hours. A quote from the time said, "They run up the hills and they stagger down. Their motto is hurry, hurry, hurry." There's no chance for relaxation, no chance for long and inspiring views from the hilltops. And many hikers of the time agreed with that assertion. Thru hiking seemed to threaten some of the philosophical underpinnings of their sport, because Americans at the time viewed hiking as an opportunity to escape regimentation, slow down, enjoy the scenery, restore energy, test your will, even worship God. Traditionally, a journey along the trail was seen as an end in itself, without a need to complete the entire trail or earn recognition. But in the case of thru hiking in the 1920s, there appeared to be other goals, such as fame and speed and accomplishment. More troubling, the club culture at the time held that hiking was something that you do in the company of others, not alone. Thru Hikers Expedition proved that it was possible to hike without a camp cook, heavy equipment, experienced guides, or all the other benefits of organized club outings. And traditionalists with the Green Mountain Club and with the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference partially criticized this form of hiking, seeing it as undermining their clubs. So I mention all of that at length because it shows you that before Earl's hike, thru hiking was met with skepticism. It was seen as something maybe impure for a hiker to care about walking a whole trail. When it came to the Appalachian Trail, Benton Mackay and other ATC leaders never really intended it to be hiked in an entire continuous trip. Contemporary articles in the Appalachian Trailway News questioned whether a through hike was even possible, and discouraging proclamations from the ATC suggested, quote, such expeditions are somewhat in the nature of stunts. So in light of these misgivings, Earl Shaffer was perhaps the ideal person to make the first trip. His relative modesty made him an appealing figure, while his somewhat naive confidence allowed the grueling trip to seem like a pleasant outing, or as he would call it, a long cruise. And we all know the history of Earl achieving his early goals. So intentionally or not, the AT had its first through hiker, one which through his personal story and the way he spoke and wrote about the trail, undermined all that previous criticism of long distance hiking. Earl wanted to experience the trail for a variety of reasons, but wasn't seeking out fame. His writing about scenic vistas, nature, experiences with people living along the trail, and his accurate and realistic description of the realities of such a long walk all rang entirely authentic. Here was a form of through hiking that seemed to pay tribute to the initial intent of trails. In the years that followed, interest in the trail, as Brian noted in his remarks, would increase. National Geographic and other publications would start paying attention, and other hikers, Gene Edsby, Colin Fletcher, would go on to hike not just the AT, but many other trails, including the inner rim of the Grand Canyon in 1963. So what I want to argue in closing is that Earl was a solitary figure, and yet he felt an obligation to give back to the Appalachian Trail and to the community. Let me just skip ahead here a second. He was at once a long-distance hiker, arguably the most famous hiker in U.S. history, but he cut his teeth walking the low hills of the Conewago Creek Valley in York County, finding deep meaning in a somewhat humble and imperfect place. So he reminded us one not need travel far to fall in love with hiking. He was sometimes a solitary figure, yet felt a strong responsibility to volunteer his time and effort, which he did throughout his adult life with the ATC, the Susquehanna Appalachian Trail Club, and advocating for trails and hiking across America. And this is a reminder, as Brian noted, for tens of millions of Americans who hike each year but fail to put their own sweat or financial equity into the organizations that make our trails possible. He loved the AT, but as we know, he could also be an outspoken critic when he saw things that the ATC, the National Park Service, and others didn't like, or did that he didn't like. He found equal admiration for people and places along the AT as he did for wildlife, nature, and scenic vistas, striking a balance that I think appeals to many hikers today who find value in the history and culture and communities surrounding trails. He pulled off one of the most iconic and challenging feats in all of hiking, not once, but 3 times, and did it with minimal equipment and a great pair of boots you'll hear about a little later, but argued throughout his life that hiking should be something that's accessible to all. At a time when the cost of outdoor equipment creates barriers to access for many would-be hikers, he is a reminder that at its heart, hiking is a very simple activity that should be accessible to all. Finally, in addition to the art of through hiking, Earl taught us that being a hiker or trail supporter can and should take many different forms, and that there's no singular way to engage with the outdoors. Perhaps most importantly, from my perspective, that even when you walk alone, you can be part of something much bigger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You got to the heart of it. Thank you. It's beautiful. As just a token of appreciation, we have a medallion in honor of the 75th anniversary of through hiking that we would like to present to you. It's a pin, and if anyone else would like to purchase a pin, you may do so at our booth. And we also have one that we'll work on a hiking pole. So thank you very much. We appreciate it. Thank you. I have the great pleasure now of introducing Andrea Shapiro. About 5 years ago, we were undecided if it was 5 years or 6 years ago. Andrea approached us about writing a children's book Now, she thought she was maybe having to beg and get permission. We were thrilled because we were looking for someone to write a children's book. And Andrea Shapiro wrote the most beautiful book called 2,000 Miles to Happy. And she herself is an avid hiker, and so I give you Andrea Shapiro.
Thank you. So I clearly don't need to tell this crowd about Earl, and I don't need to tell them about the AT. So I just wanted to say a little bit about how we get from here, Earl's wonderful book, to something that we can share with children. And anybody who is familiar with Earl's writing, his poetry, I wanted to honor that, but I didn't want to copy his poetry or just put his poetry in there. I wanted to do it in a way that was yet lyrical and engaging with kids. Part of that reason is in Earl's legacy of the trail, how do we engage the next generation in something? We have to get them to love it, to respect it, to want to be part of it. And we do know, actually there is research on this that shows the link between nature and healing. And I do believe that nature can be very healing. Just being out there, walking. I've talked to other authors who said that some of their best ideas come from just walking. And so I think there's some kind of connection between being in nature and walking and moving and a part of our brain. It just connects with it. So I wanted to engage that part of what we're about, what people who respect Earl, love Earl, or families with Earl, and hike the trail. So actually, I was thinking about the trail itself and how I was going to approach writing the trail, and came across Earl's story, and thought, oh gosh, I'm writing about a person. I don't want to upset people who really knew him, so I did. I contacted the Earl Shaffer Foundation, and along the way, they saw multiple versions of it. And let's see, that was in 2018. I actually had a version, and I met Kimberly and Dan here, and some other members of the family, I don't know if they are, and wrote a version called Walking with Walter. Didn't work. It just wasn't the story I wanted to tell. It was way too long. I grew up a long time ago, and picture books when I was growing up were very, very wordy. Anybody who reads picture books to kids now knows they're much more concise. A picture book author is looking at a goal of around 500 words. Maybe with a picture book biography, I can get away with about 700 words. So to take that book and condense it down, I had to pick what I wanted. Now, some people think that a picture book author has to do the illustrations too. I'm not an artist. So when I went to seek out a publisher with what was the current version of it, 2,000 Miles to Happy, usually when you approach a publisher, they take over it from there. And you work with the editor, and the art director finds an illustrator, and these two people, the author and the illustrator, never talk, never meet. Possibly on some historical item they might be consulted as the author, but really they have no input in who the illustrator is. A very unique experience. The editor at Muddy Boots said, well, what do you think about illustrations? I said, you're not supposed to ask me that. So I kind of put it on the back burner, and months later, got my copy of the AT Journeys magazine, and it happened to be an issue that was called Trail as Muse. And in it, I found this amazing watercolor by a woman named Rebecca Harnish. I said, that's it. That's the voice I want in this book. So through the editor of the AT Journeys magazine, I found her Instagram stuff. This is how you have to do research these days. I found her Instagram page, and I looked at her work and found her sunsets, and I love sunsets. And I said, okay, that's my illustrator. So she got her contract, I had my contract, and the editor, as I said, say, okay, now you guys work together. So we talked a lot about what we wanted, what we saw. Rebecca is a thru hiker. She's done 2 stages of her Triple Crown. She knows the AT. And so when she read the book, when she read my manuscript for this, she could connect with it. She could connect emotionally because she had been through those pieces. And I was so fortunate to have a part in helping to pick the palette of the book. She gave me a bunch of options, and I said, that's the one I connect emotionally with. That one gives me that feeling. So we worked together like that, and it was just a marvelous experience. I just want to read just a tiny bit of it. Obviously, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but oh, thank you. Picture books, you're supposed. Oh, you're going to hold them. Oh, great. Cool, thanks. Okay. Picture books are visual. Those of you who read to kids know that if the kid's not interested in the story, they turn the page, right? Real fast, right? So my responsibility is to make sure the words are engaging and get them to the next page, or they'll close it on you, right? Not interested, but kids are so honest. But the pictures have to tell part of the story too. As an author, we're always told, leave room for the illustrator. So that's what I try to do. The mountains called to Earl Shaffer when he was a boy. He followed forest trails, slept beneath starry skies, and warmed his hands by a glowing campfire. In those mountains, Earl was happy. And there's Walter and Earl made a plan, big as those mountains, wide as the sky, and glorious as all outdoors. One day, he hiked the Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine. So, the next thing I talked about was a little bit about his time in the Pacific and why his coming back, he needed to hike the trail at that point. So I'm going to jump through to the end because this is spoiler alert, he did finish the trail. One more state, Maine. One more mountain, Katahdin. One more mile, up, up, up. Giant boulders blocked the way. A strong wind pushed. Earl pushed back, step by step by step. There's animals in every picture, and we've got little ants here next to him. 4 months, 4 days, 4 hours, through rain, wind, and cold. On a sunny August afternoon in 1948, Earl Shaffer stood on a Maine mountaintop beside another weather-beaten sign. Patchwork lakes glistened below. A yodel floated up the mountain, and Earl yodeled back. He knew the trail would call again, to walk under snow-white clouds, to drink from cold mountain streams, to feel the earth beneath his feet. Because in those mountains, Earl felt peace. Earl felt free. Earl was happy. So I had to pick some spot illustrations for the back matter, which is stuff that a kid might read, an adult might read to them if it's used in schools or in libraries. It might be used to engage kids to further information. So I got a picture of Earl building a shelter, not this one. And also, in honor of our next speaker, a picture of his boots at the end. So, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for being part of our day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Luke Colby. It's so wonderful how this is segueing beautifully because Luke Colby is the current president, owner, CEO of the Russell Moccasin Boot Company, the makers of those famous bird shooter boots that Earl wore, a single pair that lasted him the entire length of the Appalachian Trail. You did have to have them resold, but the boots, and they are existent, smelly as they are, at the Smithsonian right now. I get some worse. Sorry. But the other thing about Luke, I just discovered he owns an English setter. Now, if that's the only thing you could say about Luke, that makes him aces in my book. Anyway, Luke Kobe, thank you.
It's an honor and a privilege to be here with you all today, and I'm very excited. Dan and Sanne and the whole board who invited us to come here, and we've kind of been on a journey with them working on our anniversary pair of boots this year since I believe February of this year. And this year is a really exciting year for us. It is both our 125th year anniversary as a company. We were founded in 1898 in a little town called Berlin, Wisconsin, and we've been there ever since, and only our second building since then. And so this being also the 75th anniversary of Earl's famous hike in 1948, is a dual anniversary that we're very excited to celebrate. I'm going to talk a little bit about boots, but I'm going to talk more about conservation and what brings us all here and binds us together, and I believe was one of the foundational concepts and the way that Earl lived his life. Earl had a quote that was on one of his famous quotes from his book, and is now on each one of the boot boxes of the boots that we make at Russell Moccasin. And he says, "Carry as little as possible, but choose that little with care." And for a man with few material possessions like Earl did, who lived his life in the outdoors, a lot of his life on the trail, to have a pair of boots that at the time he bought them, possibly secondhand, but even then they were about double the cost of a normal pair of boots to get a pair of Russell's moccasins then, because of the amount of labor and time that even went into them then, and we still make them the same way. But for him to choose that and then go on the trail and spend the next 4 or 5 months of his life wearing that one pair of boots, ditching his tent and sleeping underneath the tarp for most of that time, tells me something about why he wanted to wear that pair of boots. And it's amazing to me that other expeditionaries like Charles Lindbergh, President Eisenhower have also chosen our boots. But I think it comes back to that: choose what you carry, but choose it with care. And that brings me to the idea of conservation, and I believe that we as humans have two responsibilities that I think are inherent and innate. The first of which is that we are the beneficiaries of nature. We have all these amazing natural resources that we've been granted to build cities, to build these pavilions, to take and to use to our benefit. But I also believe that we are stewards. We have a responsibility to take care of those natural resources. And I believe this is very much in line with the way that Earl lived his life. And so how do you reconcile the fact that Earl had this very, very nice pair of boots, and yet was not materialistic and was a great conservationist and a sportsman? And it's the same way, we have a saying and a concept, a philosophy that guides everything that we do at Russell Moccasin. And we call that philosophy conservation through craftsmanship. And it's simply the idea that the best way to preserve our natural resources, the best way to provide the best value to the people that we serve through the boots that we make, is not to make a disposable product that's going to waste the time, the materials, the effort that goes into making that boot that you're going to have to then purchase again. It's to make a product of such high quality and of such value and design it from the very beginning to ensure that it can be repaired, that it can be serviced for the lifetime of that boot. And most people get between 20 and 50 years out of a pair of Russells. And so we make boots so that you can make history. We make boots in such a way, the same way we've made them for 125 years, because we believe that it's a way to steward the natural resources we've been granted and given by making a product that pays homage to those resources, that doesn't waste those resources. It's kind of back to the same clean your plate, waste not, want not mentality, that if you're going to do something, do it in such a way that that material, that labor can last and be a part of somebody's life for a very, very long time. And it's why I do what I do. It's why I'm a craftsman. I started as a leather worker in middle school, started a company building luggage, and was lucky enough to become part of the Russell Moccasin Company last year in October. And why am I involved in craftsmanship? Why do I love nature and the outdoors and spending time on the trail? It all comes back to those same two responsibilities that I believe that each of us have that is also what brings us to Earl Shaffer and is part of his legacy of conservation. And so the things that we use, the things that we make, the way that we live our lives, I think can also be in parallel and can be equitable to the way that we believe that we should treat our natural resources. Those two things don't have to be at odds, but I think we have to have a philosophy of how do we achieve that practically? How do we make products that are both allowing craftsmen to do their trade to their utmost, but are also a way for us to conserve those natural resources, which we believe are so valuable. And we're very, very excited to continue that legacy, to be able to continue making the exact same pair of boots that Earl wore on the trail 75 years ago today, to do that anniversary pair that we're doing this year. And would love to talk to you more about that, but I know I'm the last guy holding you up for lunch. So I appreciate the time that you all have given me to speak a little bit about why I do what I do, and really appreciate being a part of this whole event. And you guys have a fantastic day. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is the dual anniversary, 75 years of thru hiking and 125 years in business. We are going to be running a raffle to win a pair of special edition Earl Shaffer boots. You will need to keep your eye on our website. You can look on Facebook for the Earl Shaffer page. You can look at the AT Museum website. You'll see it advertised in the future. So keep your eye open on that. And we hope you'll enter, and one lucky person is going to walk away with a beautiful pair of bird shoe boots. So thank you very much.
My name is Luke Colby, and I'm the CEO of the Russell Moccasin Company. And this is the most similar boot that we have in our archive to the boot that Earl wore on the trail back in 1948. This is the bird shooter model. This one was probably made in around 1930, so a couple years before Earl's hike in 1948. But same model, same height, same construction method, and then bring it to show kind of the similarities between how that pair of boots was made and also the pair of boots that we're making now. So this is kind of the equivalent boot that we're making today. The same hand stitching methods, the same construction. We obviously make additions in the innovation side of the boots to continually better our boots and make them reasonable for today's hiking, but it's still the same boots that was used in 1948 to complete the entire Appalachian Trail.
Very cool.
Same construction method, and that's what makes it special, is that moccasin construction method, because of its durability and its ability to go long distances and be resold over and over and over again, which you need when you're doing a 2,050-mile trek. So.
Okay, and can you tell me a little bit of history where you were able to find that?
So this pair of boots we found on eBay, and
Okay.
we purchased. This pair of boots was one that Russell made for a company in Chicago called Von Linkirk and Antoine, which was kind of the REI of the time.
Okay.
And so you can see the little Russell Moccasin label
I
there
see
on the
that.
inside,
Okay.
and then the other, the left boot would have had their label sewn into that. But it's most likely that Earl ordered his pair of boots from a store like Von Linkirk and Antoine, or got it secondhand somehow. We don't know exactly how he got his pair of Russells. But we do know this is the same model that he wore at that time.
All right, well, thanks for sharing that with
Yeah,
us.
absolutely.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? So I'm Larry Luxembourg, president of the Appalachian Trail Museum, and it's my pleasure today to start on the dedication of the Darlington Shelter here. It's been a long project for us, over 10 years, and today we're lucky to have the two people who were most instrumental in putting this project together. Our first speaker is going to be Larry Knudsen of Penn Trails. Before I met Larry, I didn't know there was a professional trail builder association, but Larry's one of the top 100 trail builders in the United States and has done some really monumental trail building projects, really gifted trail builder. And we were lucky to have him involved in some of our early projects at the museum, including the shelter project as a volunteer. So we'll have Larry, and then afterwards Karen Balaban. I'll introduce Karen separately. So Larry.
My name is Larry. Just to give you context, Penn Trails has been in business as a standalone company, as corporation, for about 16 years, I guess. And before that, like many of you, I cut my teeth on trails, but I came up in New England on trails in New Hampshire, Vermont, the Long Trail, we heard about that today, the White Mountains, the Presidential Range, Connecticut, and I hiked my first section of the AT at the age of 12 or 13 because my parents would say, go outside and play, don't come back till we call you. And one day I said, well, I think I'll just do the Massachusetts section and maybe they'll call me, you know? So Penn Trails, we have worked over these years from literally Oregon on Montana to Maryland and New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, all over the place. And our trails have been everything from a small trail that we did last year in the city of Pittsburgh in a very impoverished neighborhood to a wilderness trail with accessibility, which is our specialty, on the Clark's Fork River where Lewis and Clark stepped foot in Montana. A 100-foot cable suspension bridge, which I thought might drive me out of my mind, across the glacial moraine in Illinois, you name it. I mention that because every project has, for me, and I'm sure for any of you trail builders, maintainers, volunteers, hikers, through hikers, support, making the beans, whatever you do, we all have memories of the people and the places. That's the best thing about this career, is all the people I have met, there we go, and all the stories they have shared. I never met Earl Shaffer, but in those stones up there, when I would spend time when I first saw the shelter and my trail crew first cleared out all the brush and fallen trees and everything so we could get close to it, I was telling Karen, I went up there one time and I just sat down on the ground and I looked at that wall that he had built. Now, one reason I did that was because I had to come up with a grid system that I could market, but not indelibly, and record every single stone where it was and also how it was fit together, photograph and video everything, do the drawings that somebody someday might use to put it back together again. That was the first iteration of our work, and Karen and I worked closely with other folks to get that piece done. For instance, my very good friend Max Bramall is here. He just showed up. He is I don't know how many decades long AT trail overseer down on the Maryland border. Where are you, Max? I'm over here. He's over there, standing as a true trail maintainer always does. Max helped me to grid it out. I don't know how many times we walked up and down there. There was a couple of us that did that. And my memory of it was that as I sat there after we did that and went back just to kind of think about, okay, now how am I going to take this thing apart? I had kind of this Zen experience, I felt like I I see what this guy was doing here. I mean, every stone was so carefully chosen and fit together. He did use Portland cement to stick it all together, and it stood the test of time. One of my favorite things to say when I'm teaching trail workshops is water always wins and gravity never loses. And well, I'll tell you, Earl had a sense of that up there on that mountain. On what's it called? Cove Mountain?
Blue Mountain.
Blue Mountain. I've been to too many mountains. So, man, that thing was solid when we got up there, wasn't it, Max? And it had been through a lot. Now, the timbers and the tin and all that, it would show time. But he really had designed that thing to last. And so, you know, my notes included that it was at 950 feet elevation on land, state game land parcel number 170. It was 14.8 feet long, 10.6 feet wide, 6.9 feet tall at the highest open face side, and 4 feet tall on the rear end. And we measured it, and we marked it, and we photographed it. And when we left, and had to come back the next year because of all the state permitting and everything we needed to do, and Karen and I understood that. That was a process because my company, Penn Trails, had to get a permit that was to demolish a building on state game lands. I think of a building like that, but you know, you do what you got to do, right? And so some folks I know would ask Karen or I, hey, you know, why is this taking so long? Well, the other thing was we only had, 2 months window that we were allowed to go in there and do this because of the animals, P&DI, hunting, day use, I mean, all kinds of stuff. So it took a year to get back there to take it apart. The roof and the timber on the roof and the tin came off first, and as I recall, Jim Foster took care of getting that to the temporary storage we had at a storage unit, Larry, I guess, right, that was down there on Walnut Bottom Road. I'm not sure the shelter wasn't stronger than that place. And so, you know, the stone shelter, you can read all the statistics and hear about it in the exhibit. I'm not going to go through that. But when we finally got to the point of taking it apart, which was June 5th of 2012, we took one last whack at all the photography and everything, and we did a 24-inch by 24-inch gridding system and fine-tuned that one more time. And then on July 27th, it's when 4 members of my trail crew at Penn Trails and I went up, cleared the brush, the fallen trees, cut everything out, because before then it was like slashing your way through the jungle. And we got everything ready for the crew to come in on July 28th. The crew was Karen and the SATC, and I don't want to miss anybody if there was other organizations there, but there were about, as I recall, about 8 to 10 people with your group. And then it was really cool because there were 2 volunteers who weren't part of any of these organizations, but they'd read about it online. One fellow who, his name is, where is it here? Mike Pantalone. He was from outside Philly. And he was at the time a long distance trail runner. And he'd read about this in some article, and he drove all the way from Philadelphia and showed up to help. Another guy, Ron Bungay from Baltimore, had read about it, and he had been involved in PATC and building some shelters, and he showed up. Ron, you're here. See, brother, I didn't forget. And thank you for your service. Are you Navy? Army, okay, well, I got a buddy over here who's Army, all right, so we never met until that day, did we? He just walks in and says, here I am. Well, we kept him busy for about 8, 9 hours. So I got there about 7 in the morning, And the other people I want to mention, you can't have names like this without a trail project or vice versa. Walt Fuzz Garrett and Brian Hootie Group. I don't think Fuzz is here today. I haven't seen Hootie for years. I knew them from other trail projects. So Fuzz worked for Valley Quarries at the time, and Valley Quarries agreed to provide all the heavy equipment, the skid steer, the dump truck to pull it, the trailer, the 3,000 watt generator, the hydraulic hammer. Valley Quarries should be mentioned because they let us use all that stuff. Now Penn Trails had to write an insurance on it, but they let us use it. They didn't charge us. And then, if any of you know how it feels to ride a skid steer, Fuzz Garrett rode that thing all day long for over 8 hours, except for a lunch break, 1.5 miles each round trip to move every pallet of stone up and down that mountain to the 26-foot trailer, flatbed trailer that we were loading it on. These kinds of volunteers you can't make up. You know that because many of you are those kinds of people and you have friends who are like those kinds of people. That's why this thing is here. So, based on the total cubic feet of stone that I had calculated in June, I got in touch with the Naval Depot and I got 10 slightly used, almost new, 4x4x4 GSA military grade pallets to put the stone in. I figured if it can stand the work in Afghanistan, it'll work here. So I was mostly right, I think, except for one or two. So each pallet was loaded with about 1/2 ton of stone. And we had 9 pallets, more or less, all together on a truck bed that was 26 feet long and, I don't know, 8 feet wide or whatever. And we would get the stone in, we being the volunteers. Hootie was hammering away at the stone, and I was doing it sometimes. And we found out that the stone didn't come down in nice, neat, big chunks that Portland cement would hold together. It would just kind of explode. And now I'm running around picking up stones, trying to keep them in the blue group or the green group or the E group or whatever. And somebody said to me today, yeah, it went pretty seamlessly and easily, didn't it? I was like, oh yeah. Depends on where you were standing, so, or lying down from exhaustion. But the first section of that east wall, which Karen has a picture of, if you want to see what it looked like before it came down, it came down in a very unorganized way. And we adapted. Around noon, we had our lunch break. We had a crock pot running off the 3,000 watt generator. There was almost a mutiny before lunch because everybody was so tired, thirsty, and hungry. And the person who made that great crock pot at barbecue is here. Sharon. I hadn't seen Sharon since lunch 12 years ago or 11 years ago. She wants a picture of any of you that were part of that day, us to get together. Some of us survived that day. The others, we just remember now. So while the crew was gathering and kind of palletizing those first sections, and we broke down finally and had lunch, at noon we had 4 of the 9 pallets done. And 40% of the structure disassembled. This is a trail dude, you know, at PTBA level talking. Everything is calculated, measured, budgeted. So I can say, yeah, 40%, this many tons. The weather had held, but Karen and I that morning had looked at it and said, you know, there's supposed to be a thunderstorm somewhere in this valley later today. And I remember around lunch, we looked at each other and said, you know, I can hear the thunder in the distance, but I think it's going to stay away. And we're in really good shape. So after lunch, Fudge and Hootie and I decided we better start those first 5 pallets down the road, if you want to call it a road, to the road where the truck was. And we needed to make room because the volunteers, the other pallets, we couldn't get everything done. The stone was building up. So after 2 hours nonstop, and Fuzz driving up and down that road, that washed out, blown out thing for all that time, we had 5 loads done, 3 others were waiting, and the final one was getting put together. The crew wasn't able to finish that final one because around 3:30 the weather said, guess what? Weather always wins and gravity never loses. And so at that point it let go, and it was thunder, but it was lightning strikes all over. So Karen got all the volunteers down the mountain. I think Fuzz and Hootie were under my insurance, I guess. I don't know, but we had to get it closed up at some point. And so in really heavy rain, we got one pallet halfway down, and it got so wet that it just blew apart on the side of the trail. Later on, Karen and people would go back and collect that somehow on the side of the road, weeks or whatever later. 2 others came down in this rain okay, and the final one was when the storm, which I thought was at its full force, really hit. It was almost like a microburst, and I'm not making this up. At this point, it's just Fuzz and I. Hootie had like abandoned all hope and was going down the mountain. And I'm up on, now, I guess I'm a little wiser now. I'm up on a flatbed truck, which doesn't much road on the one side. And here comes Fuzz with this last one. I'm standing on this surface, which is all, just water flying off of it. Anybody guess what happened when we put that pallet down? It started chasing me across the deck. And this guy Fuzz, Karen, we never would have done the project without him. I hope his name gets put in this thing somehow, because really Fuzz was also the kept me from getting squished by that thing, because he caught it with the end. He got his skid steer around and caught it just enough way up that it turned it, and I jumped off the truck. So that was the scary story. That's the scary memory of this project for me.
The truck bed was all metal, if I remember. Something.
Yeah, it was good for a lightning storm. Everything was really good for working in heavy lightning, yes. Thank you. That brings back the terror now for me. So anyway, we took a deep breath. I got back up. I got some cinch straps around it. We pushed it in. We tied it off with some other pallets. We got it all in. And there we were. At 5:30, we packed up everything, got the equipment in. A lot of the volunteers then left, but Karen, Jim, Eric, I, Hootie, Fuzz, we headed across the valley. I guess it's about a 40-mile trip, isn't it? Yeah. And, in heavy rain, we drive down through Sterrett's Gap and down into Carlisle and through Carlisle. And I'm looking out the window of the truck that I'm driving and thinking, this is the strangest procession. So we get there to Pine Grove. And now it's about, I guess according to this, it's about 6:30. I got on the mountain at 7 a.m. Karen was there about 7 or so. It had been a long day, and we still had to unload it. And so we unloaded it, and everybody hung in there. And then Karen and Fuzz and Hootie and Mike left, or actually Mike then followed me. We took the truck back to Penske in Mechanicsburg, turned around, and then finally got home, and I think I was in bed about 9:30 or 10. My notes indicate that when I went back and looked at my notebooks, that wasn't lost on a hard drive that died. I'd written down, Karen said, this project was gargantuan. That's the word you used coming off the mountain. I wrote it down. As I stand here today and I tell you this story, which I hope you found some fun or humor or interest in, what I want to talk about is the same thing you've heard again and again today. Just mentioned the commitment of people, the caring, the giving, the warmth, the embrace of old friends, the paths that cross and cross again after years. I won't get into it, but I had fun talking to somebody about working on the Tuscarora years ago, and that's another crazy project. But point is, we're all here because someone put it in somewhere, which eventually connects back to Earl Shaffer in the shelter, which was 1957? 57, yeah. We all got that. We're all here because of that. And, you know, you can't pay for that. You can't buy that. You can't just say it. You got to do it. And people always remember what you do and not what you said. So thanks for being here. Thanks for supporting this effort. And in memory of Earl Shaffer.
Thanks, thanks, Larry, and thanks again for the great work you did on that project. After we dedicate the shelter, we'll have a little time before our speaker. We have a speaker at 2 on geological history and trail experiences right here at 2. But in between, there's books on sale in the museum, Andrea's children's book and Earl Shaffer's books and other things up at the museum. But after Karen speaks, we want to do a real trail inauguration, dedication of the shelter. So what we're going to do is we're going to have everybody go up and surround the shelter, and then we're going to have Odie lead us in some hiker cheers to really properly dedicate this shelter. We're going to do it an AT way, and there's nobody better to do that than Odie. So this ceremony has brought back some memories to me. The inside shelter, the Earl Shaffer shelter we've had, it's the centerpiece of the museum since we opened in 2010. Some people from SATC, Karen Balaban, normally one of the ringleaders, Jeff Bueller over here. Jeff took me up on Peter Mountain to see that shelter and told me it'd be an easy project. So we had 40 people on an August day for the 50th anniversary of Earl's first thru hike. So we had 40 people dedicate that shelter, do a ceremony, and then we hauled that shelter out log by log 3 miles to the road and eventually reconstructed that in the museum. I should have known better after that, but Jeff and Michelle Miller and Karen and some of the other people said, you know, there's this one other Shafer shelter out there, and you really should preserve that for the museum. So this was in the winter, and they took me out on snowshoes. One of my snowshoes kept falling off. I thought I was gonna die on the way to this shelter. And then we see this shelter, and it was a total wreck, and, you know, pretty remote where it was off the AT. So anyway, we planned this project, you know, as Larry said, it took 2 years to get that part of it done, and another 11 to finally get it done. But it's a great project. So anyway, in a minute I'll introduce Karen, and then as soon as she's done, let's all gather around the shelter, and we'll do a proper dedication, hiker style. So Karen has been a dedicated volunteer, particularly for Susquehanna AT Club, and she's always a fountain of ideas and energy. She's been instrumental in raising money and helping out for the Iron Masters Hostel and lots of other things. And after we get this dedicated today, I'm no longer taking calls or emails from Karen. So I learned slow, but eventually I learned. But anyway, this was Karen's inspiration, and she provided the energy and dedication and so forth to bring us to this day. So Karen, please tell us your story.
Well, you know, they say there's three sides of the story. His side, her side, and the truth. So take all of this with a little bit of grain of salt. So I'm Karen Balaban, and I think at the time I might have been I was president of the SATC. My trail name's Second Wind. But I got my start with the AT Museum. Again, my friend Sharon helped. So this museum was opening up, and we're all excited. And I came up with my first idea. We did the hike to history. And we started at Kings Gap and hiked down the Buck Ridge Trail to the opening ceremony. I think we raised $3,000 that day, which isn't bad for, what, a 8-mile hike? Anyway, so about a couple years after the museum opened, well, actually, I'll tell you a little bit about it. It was my truck that got the Earl Shaffer shelter that's in the museum. First, we moved it to Scott Farm, then a year later, moved it down here. I don't have a truck anymore, but we fit everything in there. I had an extra extended truck bed, but that was a lot of work. We had a lot of helpers. We had people from several of the clubs help out that day. Then after the museum been open a year or two, I said, Larry, how's everything going, your exhibits? He goes, well, we're starting to think that maybe we should do an outdoor exhibit. And Jeff Bueller, who's our trail master from SATC, he had told me about this stone shelter that Earl built up on Blue Mountain at Dean's Gap. So if you're familiar with when the AT currently goes over out of the Cumberland Valley and before it gets to the Darlington Shelter, there's a junction with the Darlington Trail, which goes east, and the Tuscarora Trail that goes west. Well, if you go about 0.8 of a mile, you come to the shelter's was off the ridge a little bit, but there's a game road there. Well, like you say, you want to call it a road, but anyway. So I went out there and saw it, and I thought, oh, sounds interesting. And we talked Larry into coming out there, and we had this snow. We were fence posting. Larry, I think why your snowshoes kept falling off, I think they were old as Earl Shaffer's. He had those classic snowshoes that you see advertised in LL Bean that you hang over your fireplace as a decoration. But so then there was plenty of things to keep the museum occupied. So that project got put on the back bench, and finally, I think it was at the Hall of Fame last year, Larry said, we're ready. So then I'm still working, I'm self-employed, and I found some time in May. I said, should I start? He goes, so he wanted to do something special to commemorate Earl's 75th anniversary of his thru hike. So I knew what my time frame was. So in May, I contact Chris Halk. By the way, the park has been, from day one, the managers of this park have been fabulous in terms of their cooperation and support and enthusiasm for everything that the museum has done. So please, if you see any of them, thank them for all that. It's what's made this such a wonderful place. So then in the middle of June, when Chris finally had time, we came here, we walked through, figured out where it was going to be. Being a lawyer, I had my agenda 2 pages long to make sure I covered every point that might come up, wrote my notes down, and by the end of July, I submitted a 3-page proposal and 5 exhibits. Basically, I tried to anticipate every question they could have. So I called Chris back in a week, and he says, just acknowledge if you got it, because I think I regular mailed it. And then in September, when I got back to him, he said, well, it's up in Central. I said, what's that mean? He says, Harrisburg. Well, I live in Harrisburg, so I know what that's like. So now it's January, and we haven't heard. Let's just say I left someone a voicemail, and within days we had it approved. We'll just leave it at that. But But Larry, that day, I'll go back a little bit. That day, he was right about going up that hill, and you can imagine. I don't know what you would even compare it to. Think of the little wagon you would ride as a kid that has no suspension, and now you're carrying this how many hundreds of pounds of stone, and you're for 3/4 mile down the road. We do have I have a photograph from the group that volunteers I brought that day, and I would like to say their name, and you can wave your hand again. Sharon, the SATC. Many people may know this man. He's now deceased. Tom Johnson, who was from PATC, and he was just excellent. He has a great book on the Appalachian Trail. Another person that was there that day, a member of our club who's now deceased, is Jack Bushy. Gary LaBelle, there's Gary. He's our sawyer. A friend of mine, Greg Curran, he couldn't make it today. Larry, of course. Hootie and Fuzz were great. Because I came here all the way. I didn't stay as long as you, but I stayed till you went to return the truck. So I was here till the finish, and it was a long day, and I wasn't working as hard as you. But I remember that. And let's see, Larry, let's see who else we got in here. Okay, that's all I can recognize in here. Oh, myself. Oh, okay, but black and white. We're hopefully put a slideshow to do this. So anyway, we get this approved, but then in mid-January, but then life gets in the way, right? So finally, I get a request for bids already in May for the stonemason. Call people, I've been collecting names, call everybody. Everybody's too busy. So finally, and I even brought one fella down, he was all excited about it. He says, I really can't promise to have it done by your deadline. So the one fellow who had done some work for me on my property in Perry County, he says, Karen, I want to be part of this. So Troy Forlisi and his assistant, Jason, did this work. They started on, well, first we had to build a foundation, and that was an interesting day. That was July 27th. And Judy here? Yeah, Judy, Mark, and Rick Miller, myself. Rick couldn't make it. We thought we were going to have to pound off the old cement that was still adhering to the stones, but instead we had 10 pallets all piled up. If you look through the trees, you see the brown building, and we had to get it here to this site, and we didn't have any front end loaders. So we broke each pallet up. Troy was there to check out things, and he volunteered his truck and his time. We loaded up his dump truck. It was a flatbed dump truck. It was flatbed. And he then brought it here and dumped it where they were going to need it. So we spent, I think we got done in about 2 hours, but then we spent probably another hour cleaning up all the debris from the pallets, the plastic, the cardboard, old tarps. The only thing we didn't do is rake because we didn't have a rake. So basically, when we were done, you didn't know that we were there. Well, we saw only one snake. That wasn't too bad. A lot of little like skinks and reptiles. So I do feel bad we sort of ruined their fort, but I'm sure there's plenty of places for them to seek refuge. So that was the only day we needed volunteers. I thought we would need more, but that was just the perfect amount, and everybody worked hard, and we got the things done that we needed to get done. So that foundation was done in one day, and what they did, so many of you might think, oh, you just pile these stones on top and cement them together and they look nice, right? Well, actually, he dug down a good 2 feet, then he brought in crushed gravel, poured that in there, because what happens is the ground freezes and thaws, dirt moves too much, and that would just create enough that the walls over time would crumble. The stone allows the moisture and stuff to go down, and it gives you, just like you have footers in your house, so it's a similar thing. And the footers are literally just below the walls themselves. We didn't have to put it anywhere else. So you got that done in a day, but then to get the stuff between weather and commitments, but he actually dropped another job. He says, no, he says, that guy can wait. Don't tell him that. I'm helping you out, Karen. So, and I didn't even have to do anything. The guy's just a really solid guy. So he came here, and thankfully, is Victoria here? Victoria is one of the docents, and she was kind enough, I think she was here every day that the stonemason here, so we actually have photos of the progress. But I'll confess it as much, and we worked so hard to get this thing, when we packed it up that day from Blue Mountain, to keep it organized, well marked, plastic cover. Over time, most of those marks went off. And having seen Troy work, this man is not a laborer, he's an artist. That rock is there, he lays it down, and in his mind, he sees exactly how those pieces are going to fit together the right way. So it's just fabulous to watch him work. And this is Troy's masterpiece, but it is still Earl Shelter. Earl was the man who found these beautiful stones. They had been part of a fence wall. At one time, there was a farm up on that ridge, and this was from the wall. That, you know how in the old days they'd used that instead of fences. So all that's there. The dimensions are the same. They're all the same rocks. Are they in the exact same order? No. It's Earl Shaffer Shelter, though, and Troy will be the first one to say the same thing. So we're very proud of the end result. It took a lot of people, and I don't know if fun's the word. It was a good challenge, and when Troy had the first wall built, I was almost in tears because I thought, oh my gosh, we're going to be here and we're going to just see a foundation. I think I might be sick that day, but no, he actually finished Thursday, and I'll tell a little tale on Troy. He wanted to get it done so fast, but he knows, because he's been doing this for 20, 30 years, he went a little too fast in one day, and he had to rebuild one of the short walls. It wasn't totally to the top, but I said, do I get more money? He says, nope, that's my fault. And I said, I'm even embarrassed that I tell you this, but you're going to get the same level of work as everybody else, so. And this is going to be dedicated, by the way. There's 31 trail maintaining clubs throughout the length of the Appalachian Trail, so we're going to be dedicating it to them. Because every club has at least one shelter that they're responsible for maintaining, and many of them have been rebuilt over the years, some more than once or twice.
Okay, thanks, Karen. And now, if you can all come up to the shelter, we're going to have the duct tape cutting and the cheer.
So it is my great honor to be up here and representing the Appalachian Trail Museum, as they are dedicating the shelter to all 31 trail clubs of the Appalachian Trail. Earl Shaffer built this shelter in 1957. As you'll know, he hiked it in 1948. And let this be a memory to you guys that when you do work on the trail, your work will outlast yourselves. So when you lay a stone for someone to walk over, you will be dead and gone, and that stone will still be a footpath. So let's give a huge hiker's hike as we dedicate the Earl Shaffer Shelter in honor of the 31 Appalachian Trail Clubs from the Appalachian Trail Museum. Hiker's hike on 3. 1, 2, 3.
Hiker's hike!
Yeah, let's do it again. 1, 2, 3.
Hiker's hike!
Duct tape cutting.
Alright guys, so thanks for joining us today as we shared all of this cool history behind the shelter that was built here. This was one that Earl Shaffer built.
Right,
It's
and
called the Darlington Shelter.
Darlington Shelter, and this is the Appalachian Trail Museum's very first outdoor exhibit, and we are so excited that we got to participate in it.
Anyhow, we hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will see you later. Bye.
So this is the only place that you are going to find on the entire Appalachian Trail that they actually encourage you to feed the wildlife. This is the donation box outside of the AT Museum, and we encourage you to feed the bear.